The Fracture of Sacred Space and the Human Project. Introduction. Western Christian systematic theology has frequently interpreted the human predicament through post-biblical philosophical categories. It often reduces the origin of cosmic fracture to the single Edenic rebellion in Genesis chapter 3. While this emphasis rightly underscores the forensic dimensions of sin, it risks obscuring the broader, organically unfolding narrative of Scripture. A text immanent hermeneutic, attentive to the Bible's own narrative logic, literary structure, and canonical shape, resists external impositions. It allows the final form of the canon, read within its ancient Hebraic cognitive environment, to govern interpretation. When approached in this manner, the human plight emerges as the cumulative result of three compounding cosmic rebellions: the fall in Eden in Genesis chapter 3, the transgression of the Watchers in Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, and the disinheritance of the nations at Babel in Genesis chapter 11, along with Deuteronomy chapter 32, verses 8 and 9. Walter C. Kaiser Junior's promise plan of God supplies the needed text-immanent framework, a single, organically unfolding divine strategy that reverses these fractures, restores humanity's royal priestly vocation as the Imago Dei within the cosmic temple, reclaims the disinherited nations, and preserves the concrete promises to ethnic Israel within the one people of God. Drawing on Carmen Joy Imes' analysis of the human project in her book Being God's Image, this essay traces humanity's trajectory east of Eden. It shows how violence, cosmic boundary crossing, and imperial centralization subverted the divine vocation, even as the ontological identity of the Imago Dei remained indestructible. Sections 1 through 3 examine the three rebellions. Section 4 engages alternative frameworks, and Section 5 traces restorative fulfillment in the Messiah. Section 1. The escalation of violence and the subversion of vocation, Genesis chapter 4. Following the expulsion from Eden, the human project continued amid escalating conflict. Genesis chapter 4 depicts rapid degeneration within Cain's line, culminating in Lamech in verses 19 through 24. Lamech's polygamy, household domination, and boast of disproportionate vengeance. If Cain is avenged sevenfold, then Lamech 77-fold, vividly illustrate humanity's distortion of God's good gifts. Creativity, authority, and sexuality, intended for blessing and ordered rule, were redirected toward self-exaltation and violence. This escalation reveals sin's primary manifestation in the human project: the instrumentalization of image-bearing capacity for the purpose of dominating and subjugating fellow bearers. Sin distorts functional glory, but does not erase ontological status. The Imago Dei remains an indestructible identity conferred by divine decree in Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 and 27, and chapter 9, verse 6. It is independent of human performance. Violence against image-bearers thus constitutes cosmic treason against the Creator's earthly representatives. Intertextually, this pattern anticipates the flood's judgment on pervasive violence in Genesis chapter 6, verses 11 through 13. It foreshadows the promised plan's reversal through the servant, who brings justice without crushing the bruised reed, as described in Isaiah chapter 42, verses 1 through 4. And echoed in Romans chapter 5, verses 12 through 21. Section 2. The second cosmic rebellion, the Watchers and the corruption of domain, Genesis chapter 6. Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4 introduces the vertical, supernatural dimension. In the Hebraic and Second Temple cognitive environment, the sons of God, the heavenly host, transgressed created boundaries by taking human wives, producing Nephilim, and imparting forbidden knowledge that accelerated idolatry and violence. Second Temple texts, such as 1 Enoch chapters 6 through 11, and Jubilees chapter 5 verses 1 through 8, elaborate on these events as illuminating context. They portray the Watchers' corruption without granting them theological authority. This narrative functions as a deliberate polemic against Mesopotamian Apkallu traditions, which credited divine sages with civilizing gifts. Scripture instead identifies them as sources of corruption. Both human and angelic rebellions, marked by violence and disruption of sacred space, prompted God's judgment of uncreation through the flood. This echoed the primordial chaos, waters, of Genesis chapter 1. Yet the recreation mandate immediately reaffirms ontological dignity. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For God made man in his own image. From Genesis chapter 9, verse 6. This post-flood declaration confirms that the Imago Dei endures cosmic catastrophe. Section 3. The third cosmic rebellion, Babel, empire, and the erasure of diversity, Genesis chapter 11. This vertical corruption sets the stage for the third fracture, in which humanity's horizontal ambitions culminate in imperial centralization at Babel. Post-flood humanity, rather than obeying the mandate to fill the earth from Genesis chapter 1 verse 28 and chapter 9 verse 1, built a city and tower on the plain of Shinar, lest we be dispersed, as stated in Genesis chapter 11 verse 4. They sought a name for themselves. The Babel narrative critiques empire, centralized power that employs violence to erase diversity and autonomy in defiance of the Creator's design. God's scattering was not merely punitive, but restorative dispersion, countering imperial domination. Deuteronomy chapter 32, verses 8 and 9 unveils its cosmic dimension. The Most High divided the nations and fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. He disinherited them to rebellious Elohim who demanded illicit worship and plunged their domains into spiritual darkness. This intensified the fracture of sacred space. The Promise Plan responds immediately through the call of Abram in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. It sets Israel apart as Yahweh's inheritance, a kingdom of priests from Exodus chapter 19, verse 6, to bless all families of the earth and to reclaim the cosmic temple. Section 4. Engaging alternative theological frameworks, a methodological correction. This text, immanent reading, corrects limitations in prevailing systems while acknowledging their contributions. Classical covenant theology helpfully emphasizes the unity and continuity of God's dealings with humanity, as well as the enduring faithfulness of divine promises. Dispensationalism has helpfully renewed attention to the literal fulfillment of promises to Israel and the importance of eschatological hope. However, covenant theology often risks structural supersessionism by spiritualizing land and national promises originally given to ethnic Israel. By flattening the origin of evil to Eden alone, it underplays supernatural warfare and Babel's disinheritance. Dispensationalism, while affirming Israel's future, sometimes introduces artificial discontinuities that fragment the single, progressive promise plan. Kaiser's Promise Plan theology offers a mediating alternative. It traces the organic, progressive revelation of Scripture, identifying a unified trajectory that honors both continuity and the concrete, future-oriented fulfillment of promises to ethnic Israel within the one people of God, as in Romans chapter 11, verses 25 through 29. While engaging canonical criticism and narrative theology, this approach remains anchored in the biblical text's own logic, resisting evolutionary models or overly Hellenistic overlays. Section 5. The Promise Plan and the Restoration of the Human Project. God does not abandon the human project. Following Babel, the Promise Plan calls Abram and forms Israel to address the fractures of sacred space. The Messiah, as the last Adam and true Imago Dei, Colossians chapter 1 verse 15, Romans chapter 5 verses 12 through 21, and 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verses 45 through 49, embodies perfect obedience. He provides vicarious atonement, disarms the rebellious powers in Colossians chapter 2 verse 15, and inaugurates a new creation. He reverses Eden's mortality through resurrection life, neutralizes the Watcher's influence, and heals Babel's division through Pentecost and the grafting of Gentiles into Israel's nourishing root, as seen in Acts chapter 2, Ephesians chapter 2 verses 11 through 22, and Romans chapter 11 verses 17 through 24. This incorporation of Gentiles expands rather than annuls the concrete promises to ethnic Israel in Romans chapter 11 verses 25 through 29. It fulfills the Abrahamic blessing to all nations in a non-supersessionist manner while preserving Israel's distinct role within the one people of God. Conclusion. Recovering the Hebraic cognitive environment and the promise plan of God illuminates the majestic trajectory of the human project. East of Eden, violence, cosmic rebellion, and imperial ambition fractured sacred space. Yet the ontological Imago Dei persisted as an indestructible identity. Through the election of Israel and the climactic work of the Messiah, the Creator defeats rebellious powers and renews image-bearers for their royal priestly vocation in the restored cosmic temple, as described in Revelation chapters 21 and 22. This vision carries concrete implications for the Church today. It grounds the inherent dignity of every person, regardless of ability, ethnicity, or status, as an image-bearer. It calls believers to resist modern forms of imperial centralization and utilitarian anthropology, to embody covenantal faithfulness in ethics and public witness, and to participate in the mission of blessing the nations through partnership, hospitality, and just economic practices rather than control or exploitation. Jew and Gentile together await the day when heaven and earth unite under the Lamb, fully manifesting the organic unity of the promise plan.